The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Amara's farm in rural Ethiopia. She knelt beside her withered maize plants, her weathered hands trembling as she touched the dry soil that had once been fertile and productive. For 3 generations, her family had worked this land, but now it seemed like the earth itself had given up hope. Thousands of miles away in Lagos, Nigeria, businessman Chike Okafor sat in his air-conditioned office, staring at charts that painted a grim picture. Nigeria, despite being Africa's most populous nation, imported over 90% of its wheat and struggled to feed its 220 million citizens. The irony wasn't lost on him. A continent blessed with 60% of the world's unused arable land couldn't feed itself. Back in Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was facing similar challenges. Despite having some of Africa's most fertile highlands, his country was trapped in cycles of drought and food insecurity. The morning briefing from his agricultural minister was particularly sobering. Over 20 million Ethiopians needed food assistance, and traditional farming methods weren't enough to break the cycle of poverty. In Nigeria's capital, Abuja, President Bola Tinubu was reviewing reports that kept him awake at night. Food inflation had reached 40%, and young Nigerians were leaving rural areas in droves, abandoning agriculture for uncertain urban futures. The country that should be Africa's agricultural powerhouse was instead spending billions on food imports. The idea began to take shape during a continental summit in Morocco. Ethiopian delegate Dr. Hannah Seneschal found herself seated next to Nigerian Agriculture Minister Dr. Akinwumi Adesina during a break between sessions. Their conversation started with polite diplomatic pleasantries but quickly turned to the frustrations both nations faced. Dr. Seneschal spoke passionately about Ethiopia's untapped potential. Millions of hectares of fertile land lying unused, abundant water resources from the Blue Nile, and a young population eager for opportunities. Dr. Adesina listened intently, sharing Nigeria's strengths, advanced agricultural technology companies, processing facilities, and most importantly, a massive domestic market hungry for affordable, locally produced food. As their conversation deepened, both realized they were describing puzzle pieces that could fit together perfectly. Ethiopia had the land and labor. Nigeria had the technology and markets. What if, instead of competing for limited resources and foreign investment, they collaborated? That evening, Dr. Seneschal called Prime Minister Abiy directly from her hotel room. Her voice carried an excitement that was rare in diplomatic circles. She explained the potential partnership she had discussed, painting a vision of transformed landscapes and prosperous communities across both nations. Meanwhile, Dr. Adesina was having a similar conversation with President Tinubu. The Nigerian leader, known for his pragmatic approach to governance, immediately grasped the implications. This wasn't just about agriculture, it was about continental integration, food security, and creating a model that other African nations could follow. Within days, technical teams from both countries were boarding planes. Ethiopian soil scientists, hydrologists, and agricultural engineers prepared detailed surveys of available farmland. Nigerian experts in mechanization, food processing, and supply chain management began drafting implementation frameworks. The numbers were staggering. Ethiopia could potentially bring 15 million hectares of additional land under cultivation. Nigeria's agricultural technology sector could provide everything from improved seeds to harvesting equipment. Combined, the two nations could potentially feed not just their own populations but export surplus to other African countries. Local communities began hearing whispers of change. In Amara's village, the local agricultural extension officer mentioned rumors of a major government initiative. Farmers gathered in the evening shade of ancient acacia trees, sharing stories and speculation about what this might mean for their struggling families. In Nigeria's Middle Belt, where fertile land had been underutilized due to security concerns and lack of investment, community leaders received visits from government officials conducting feasibility studies. The mood was cautiously optimistic. Too many promises had been made and broken before. As preliminary agreements were drafted in government offices, both nations faced internal skepticism. Critics questioned whether such an ambitious partnership could work, given the complexities of cross-border collaboration and the history of failed continental initiatives. However, something was different this time. The urgency of food insecurity, combined with the clear complementary strengths of both nations, created momentum that transcended political rhetoric. This wasn't just another diplomatic agreement. It was a potential lifeline for millions of people across both countries. The stage was set for what could become Africa's most ambitious agricultural transformation project. Two nations, separated by thousands of miles but united by shared challenges and complementary resources, were about to embark on a journey that would test their resolve, creativity, and commitment to continental unity. As the first formal meetings were scheduled, farmers like Amara continued their daily struggle against drought and poverty, unaware that their lives might soon change dramatically. The seeds of transformation had been planted in conference rooms and government offices, but their growth would depend on turning ambitious plans into practical reality on the ground. The conference room in Addis Ababa buzzed with nervous energy as delegations from both countries gathered for their first formal negotiation session. Ethiopian Foreign Minister Demeke Mekonnen straightened his tie as he reviewed the thick folder of proposals one final time. Across the table, Nigerian Minister of Agriculture and Food Security, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, shuffled through his own prepared materials, both men aware that this meeting could reshape the future of African agriculture. The Ethiopian team had spent weeks preparing their presentation. Geographic surveys revealed that the country possessed over 74 million hectares of arable land, but only 15% was currently under cultivation. The Oromia and Amhara regions alone could support mechanized farming across millions of additional hectares, provided they had access to modern equipment and technical expertise. Dr. Tigist Worku, Ethiopia's lead agricultural economist, stood before the assembled delegates with a laser pointer in hand. Her presentation revealed compelling statistics. Ethiopia's agricultural sector employed over 80% of the population, but contributed only 34% to the national GDP. The inefficiency was heartbreaking, but it also represented enormous potential for improvement. The Nigerian delegation listened intently as Dr. Worku explained Ethiopia's water resources. The Blue Nile, Tekeze, and Awash rivers could support extensive irrigation systems, transforming currently rain-dependent farming areas into year-round productive agricultural zones. However, Ethiopia lacked the financial resources and technical expertise to develop this infrastructure independently. When it was Nigeria's turn to present, Dr. Adesina painted an equally compelling picture from the opposite perspective. Nigeria's agricultural technology sector had grown remarkably in recent years, with companies like Thrive Agric and Farm Crowdy revolutionizing how farming operations were financed and managed. Nigerian engineers had developed drought-resistant seeds, efficient irrigation systems, and mobile-based agricultural advisory services that could be deployed across Ethiopia. The financial proposal was breathtaking in its scope. Nigeria would invest $1.5 billion in Ethiopian agricultural infrastructure over 5 years, while Ethiopia would commit $1 billion in land preparation, community engagement, and local workforce development. The combined $2.5 billion investment would target food crops like wheat, rice, and maize, as well as cash crops including coffee, sesame, and various legumes. Chike Okafor, representing Nigeria's private sector interests, explained the market dynamics that made this partnership essential. Nigeria imported over $3 billion worth of food annually, much of it from countries thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, Ethiopia struggled to achieve food self-sufficiency, despite having ideal growing conditions for many of these same crops. The proposed supply chain was elegant in its simplicity. Ethiopian farmers would grow crops using Nigerian technology and expertise. Nigerian companies would provide processing and packaging facilities, either in Ethiopia or through cross-border transportation networks. The final products would supply Nigeria's massive domestic market while creating surplus for export to other African countries. However, the negotiations weren't without challenges. Ethiopian officials worried about losing control over their natural resources. Some community leaders questioned whether foreign investment would truly benefit local farmers or simply create a new form of agricultural colonialism. Dr. Mekonnen addressed these concerns directly. The agreement would include strict provisions ensuring that Ethiopian farmers retained ownership of their land while gaining access to modern farming techniques and guaranteed markets for their produce. Community development programs would build schools, healthcare facilities, and infrastructure in participating regions. Nigerian negotiators faced their own domestic pressures. Critics questioned why Nigeria should invest billions in Ethiopian agriculture, when Nigerian farmers themselves struggled with inadequate support and infrastructure. Dr. Adesina explained that supporting Ethiopian production would actually benefit Nigerian agriculture by creating supply chain efficiencies and reducing overall food costs for Nigerian consumers. The breakthrough came during the third day of negotiations when both sides realized they were approaching the partnership too narrowly. Instead of viewing this as a bilateral trade agreement, they began conceptualizing it as the foundation for a continental food security network. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed made a surprise appearance at the negotiations, bringing with him representatives from local farming cooperatives. Amara, the farmer whose story had begun this journey, found herself sitting in a government conference room for the first time in her life, explaining to high-ranking officials what support would actually mean to rural communities. Her testimony was powerful and moving. She spoke about children who walked 5 kilometers to school on empty stomachs, about young people abandoning farming because traditional methods couldn't generate sustainable incomes, and about communities that had lost hope in agriculture as a viable livelihood. Nigerian businessman Chike Okafor was particularly moved by Amara's story. He shared his own background, growing up in a farming family in Kaduna State, watching his parents struggle with unreliable rainfall and limited access to markets. His success in agribusiness had always carried the weight of wanting to transform rural communities like the one he came from. The negotiation dynamics shifted from purely economic calculations to a shared vision of rural transformation. Both delegations began drafting implementation timelines that prioritized community engagement and local capacity building alongside infrastructure development. By the end of the week, preliminary agreements were in place. The partnership would begin with pilot projects in 3 Ethiopian regions, Oromia, Amhara, and Tigray, covering approximately 500,000 hectares in the first phase. Nigerian companies would establish processing facilities and provide technical training, while Ethiopian communities would contribute land, labor, and local agricultural knowledge. The announcement was scheduled for the following month, but word of the negotiations had already begun leaking to international media. Agricultural experts across Africa watched with interest, understanding that success could create a template for similar partnerships throughout the continent. As the delegations prepared to return to their respective capitals, the magnitude of what they had agreed upon was becoming clear. This wasn't just a business deal. It was an experiment in whether African nations could work together to solve their shared challenges while maintaining sovereignty and ensuring that local communities truly benefited from economic development. The international media reaction was swift and divided. CNN International ran a segment titled, "Africa's Bold Agricultural Gamble," while Bloomberg questioned whether such an ambitious cross-border partnership could overcome the continent's history of failed regional integration projects. However, it was the reaction from ordinary Africans that truly mattered. In rural Ethiopian villages, news of the partnership spread through traditional channels, conversations at weekly markets, discussions during coffee ceremonies, and announcements at community meetings. The initial response was cautious optimism mixed with healthy skepticism. Too many government promises had failed to materialize into tangible improvements for farming communities. Amara returned to her village as something of a local celebrity. Neighbors who had known her family for generations suddenly viewed her as a bridge between their struggling community and the possibility of transformation. She found herself fielding questions she couldn't answer. When would the changes begin? What exactly would farmers need to do? And most importantly, would they truly benefit, or would outsiders capture most of the value? Meanwhile, in Nigeria's agricultural heartlands, the reaction was more complex. Established farmers worried about competition, from potentially cheaper Ethiopian produce, while agricultural technology companies saw enormous business opportunities. The Nigerian Association of Farmers expressed concern that government resources would flow to Ethiopian projects, while domestic agriculture continued to struggle with inadequate infrastructure and security challenges. Dr. Adesina spent weeks traveling across Nigeria's farming regions, holding town hall meetings to explain the partnership's benefits. In Kaduna State, he addressed a gathering of over 2,000 farmers, explaining that supporting Ethiopian agriculture would actually strengthen Nigerian food security by creating reliable supply chains and reducing dangerous dependence on volatile international markets. The technical challenges were immense. Ethiopian agricultural systems were largely rain-dependent and labor-intensive, while Nigerian agriculture increasingly relied on mechanization and irrigation technology. Bridging this gap would require massive technology transfer programs and extensive farmer training initiatives. Dr. Worku led the Ethiopian technical team in conducting detailed soil analyses across the proposed project areas. The results were encouraging. Soil quality in much of Oromia and Amhara was excellent for cereal production, but required specific nutrient management strategies that Ethiopian farmers had little experience implementing. Nigerian agricultural engineer Kemi Adebayo found herself leading teams of technicians across rural Ethiopia, assessing water resources and planning irrigation infrastructure. The scale of the undertaking became clear as her team identified over 200 potential sites for water management systems, each requiring significant investment in equipment and local training. The financial complexity was equally daunting. The $2.5 billion investment needed to be distributed across multiple components: infrastructure development, technology transfer, farmer training, market development, and community development programs. Both governments faced pressure to demonstrate that such massive spending would generate concrete returns for their citizens. Opposition voices grew louder in both countries. Ethiopian economist Dr. Kadain Georges published a widely circulated analysis warning that the partnership could create economic dependence on Nigerian technology and markets. He argued that Ethiopia should focus on developing indigenous agricultural capabilities rather than relying on foreign expertise. In Nigeria, former Agriculture Minister Chief Audu Ogbe criticized the deal during a television interview, suggesting that Nigeria's agricultural challenges required domestic solutions rather than expensive foreign investments. His comments resonated with farmers who felt neglected by previous government initiatives. However, support for the partnership was building among younger demographics in both countries. Ethiopian university students studying agriculture saw the collaboration as an opportunity to access advanced training and technology that could transform their career prospects. Nigerian young professionals in agribusiness viewed Ethiopian expansion as a chance to build continental-scale enterprises. The pilot project selection process became a crucial test of the partnership's viability. Ethiopian regional governments competed to host initial implementation sites, understanding that successful projects could generate significant economic development for their areas. After extensive evaluation, 3 regions were selected based on soil quality, water access, community readiness, and transportation infrastructure. The Oromia site, located near the town of Jima, would focus on coffee production enhancement and cereal crop diversification. The Amhara location, in the fertile highlands near Bahir Dar, was designated for large-scale wheat and barley production. The Tigray site would serve as a testing ground for drought-resistant crops and advanced irrigation techniques. Community preparation became a critical component of the pre-implementation phase. Ethiopian social workers and agricultural extension agents conducted extensive consultations with farming families, explaining the partnership's goals and addressing concerns about land use, compensation, and cultural preservation. Amara found herself appointed as a community liaison, helping translate between government officials and local farmers. Her unique position, having participated in the high-level negotiations while remaining deeply rooted in rural farming culture, made her an invaluable bridge between policy and practice. The training programs began before any physical infrastructure development. Groups of Ethiopian farmers were invited to Nigeria for intensive courses in mechanized farming, irrigation management, and post-harvest processing. The cultural exchange was as significant as the technical learning, as participants from both countries discovered shared challenges and complementary strengths. Nigerian trainer Emeka Okonkwo was amazed by the work ethic and agricultural knowledge of his Ethiopian trainees. Despite lacking access to modern equipment, they demonstrated sophisticated understanding of crop rotation, natural pest management, and soil conservation techniques that could enhance Nigerian farming practices. The reverse exchange was equally enlightening. Nigerian farmers visiting Ethiopian highlands were impressed by the biodiversity and traditional farming wisdom they encountered. Many returned home with ideas for improving their own operations while becoming enthusiastic advocates for the partnership. International observers began taking notice. The World Bank sent a technical mission to evaluate the partnership's potential impact on continental food security. The African Union commissioned a study examining whether the Ethiopia-Nigeria model could be replicated across other country pairs throughout the continent. As the first infrastructure projects broke ground, the partnership moved from diplomatic agreement to practical reality. The success or failure of these initial investments would determine whether the ambitious vision of transforming African agriculture could become more than just another unfulfilled promise. The first tractors rolled off transport trucks in Jimma on a crisp October morning, their bright yellow paint gleaming in the highland sunshine. Children from surrounding villages gathered to watch as Nigerian technicians unpacked sophisticated farming equipment that most had never seen before. For Amara and hundreds of other farmers, this moment represented the transformation from promises to reality. Nigerian agricultural engineer Kemi Adebayo supervised the equipment distribution with meticulous attention to detail. Each tractor came with a comprehensive maintenance kit, multilingual operation manuals, and a commitment for 2 years of technical support. Her team had spent months adapting the machinery for Ethiopian highland conditions, modifying engine specifications for high-altitude operation, and adjusting implements for local soil types. The training compound established near Jimma quickly became the busiest location in the region. Ethiopian farmers arrived before sunrise, eager to master new techniques that could multiply their productivity. The learning curve was steep. Many had never operated mechanized equipment, and the transition from traditional hand tools to GPS-guided tractors required significant mental adjustment. Alamayahu Tadese, a 34-year-old farmer who had inherited 5 hectares from his father, found himself struggling with the complexity of modern agriculture. The Nigerian trainers emphasized precision, exact spacing for seeds, specific timing for fertilizer application, careful monitoring of soil moisture levels. It was overwhelming compared to the intuitive, experience-based farming methods his family had used for generations. However, the early results were encouraging. Test plots using Nigerian improved seeds and farming techniques showed yield increases of 40 to 60% compared to traditional methods. Word spread quickly through farming communities, generating excitement and attracting additional participants to the training programs. The infrastructure development progressed rapidly, but not without challenges. Building irrigation canals through Ethiopian highlands required navigating complex terrain and traditional land use patterns. Nigerian construction teams worked alongside Ethiopian engineers to design systems that respected local customs while achieving technical efficiency. Dr. Tigist Worku monitored the economic impact carefully, tracking not just agricultural productivity, but broader community development indicators. Early data showed increased cash flow in participating villages, as farmers began receiving advance payments for contracted crop deliveries to Nigerian processing facilities. The processing facility construction became a source of local pride and employment. The plant being built near Jimma would employ over 300 people directly, with additional indirect job creation in transportation, packaging, and administrative services. Young Ethiopians who had considered migrating to urban areas began seeing opportunities in their home regions. Challenges emerged as the project scaled up. Cultural differences between Nigerian and Ethiopian work styles sometimes created friction. Nigerian supervisors, accustomed to strict schedules and precise procedures, occasionally clashed with Ethiopian approaches that emphasized consensus building and relationship development. Language barriers proved more significant than initially anticipated. While English served as the official communication language, technical training was most effective when conducted in local languages. The project invested heavily in translator training and multilingual educational materials. The technology transfer went both directions in unexpected ways. Ethiopian farmers introduced Nigerian technicians to indigenous seed varieties that showed remarkable resilience to drought and pest pressure. These traditional crops, when combined with modern cultivation techniques, often outperformed internationally developed varieties. Amara emerged as one of the project's most successful participants. Her farm became a demonstration site, showcasing how traditional Ethiopian farming wisdom could be enhanced with Nigerian technology. Visitors from across the region came to observe her irrigation techniques, crop rotation strategies, and integrated pest management approaches. The market development component exceeded expectations. Nigerian food processing companies, initially skeptical about Ethiopian supply reliability, were impressed by the quality and consistency of the first harvest deliveries. Contracts were expanded, and additional Nigerian companies began expressing interest in Ethiopian partnerships. However, not all communities embraced the changes equally. Some traditional leaders worried about cultural disruption and loss of agricultural autonomy. In certain areas, resistance to mechanization reflected deeper concerns about young people abandoning traditional lifestyles and values. Dr. Adesina addressed these concerns during a community meeting in Amhara region, explaining that the partnership aimed to strengthen rather than replace traditional farming cultures. The goal was to provide young people with economic opportunities that would keep them connected to agriculture, rather than forcing them to abandon rural life. The women's participation component became one of the project's most innovative aspects. Ethiopian women, who traditionally managed household gardens and small livestock, were trained in greenhouse management and high-value crop production. Nigerian female agricultural entrepreneurs served as mentors, sharing business development skills alongside technical knowledge. Zenebek Bekele, a 28-year-old mother of 3, transformed her small plot into a thriving vegetable production operation, using greenhouse techniques learned from Nigerian trainers. Her success inspired other women in her community to participate actively in the partnership programs. The environmental impact assessments showed positive results. Modern irrigation techniques significantly reduced water waste compared to traditional flood irrigation methods. Integrated pest management reduced chemical pesticide use while maintaining crop protection. Soil conservation measures prevented erosion and improved long-term land productivity. International attention intensified as the first-year results became available. The African Development Bank announced plans to support similar partnerships across the continent. Ghana and Ivory Coast began exploring agricultural cooperation agreements using the Ethiopia-Nigeria model as a template. Media coverage shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism. International news outlets that had initially questioned the partnership's viability began featuring success stories from participating communities. Ethiopian farmer productivity increases and Nigerian market expansion generated positive headlines across African media. The supply chain development proved crucial to sustained success. Nigerian logistics companies established distribution networks, connecting Ethiopian production areas to processing facilities and export markets. Transportation infrastructure improvements benefited entire regions, not just participating farmers. As the first full harvest season concluded, both governments prepared comprehensive impact assessments. The initial results suggested that the partnership was exceeding productivity targets while generating broader economic development benefits. However, the true test would be whether these improvements could be sustained and scaled to reach millions more farmers across both countries. The momentum was building for expansion beyond the pilot sites, but success would depend on maintaining the delicate balance between ambitious growth and careful attention to community needs and cultural sensitivities. 2 years after the first tractors arrived in Jima, the transformation was visible from space. Satellite imagery showed vast expanses of green Where previously only scattered subsistence plots existed, the partnership had evolved from an experimental collaboration into a full-scale agricultural revolution, affecting over 500,000 Ethiopian farmers and countless Nigerian businesses. Amara stood in the middle of her expanded farm, now covering 15 hectares through a cooperative arrangement with neighboring families. The woman who had once knelt beside withered crops was now training other farmers in drought-resistant cultivation techniques. Her success story had been featured in international development publications, but she remained focused on practical, daily challenges. The economic impact data was staggering. Ethiopian agricultural GDP in participating regions had increased by 35% over 2 years. Nigerian food import bills decreased by $400 million annually as domestic supply chains strengthened. However, the human stories behind these statistics were even more compelling. In Bahir Dar, 19-year-old Meseret Alemu had abandoned plans to migrate to Addis Ababa after completing high school. Instead, she enrolled in the agricultural technology training program established through the partnership. Now she managed a 200-hectare mechanized wheat operation, employing 15 people from her community and earning more than most urban professionals. The ripple effects extended far beyond agriculture. Rural communities that had been losing young people to urban migration were now experiencing reverse migration as opportunities expanded. Schools that had struggled with declining enrollment were building new classrooms to accommodate returning families. Nigerian companies discovered unexpected benefits from their Ethiopian investments. Exposure to diverse farming conditions and traditional agricultural practices sparked innovation that improved their domestic operations. Several Nigerian agribusiness companies established permanent research facilities in Ethiopia, creating long-term institutional partnerships. The processing facilities had become economic anchors for their regions. The Jimma plant alone processed over 50,000 tons of agricultural products annually, creating value-added exports that earned foreign currency for Ethiopia while supplying Nigerian markets with high-quality ingredients. However, success brought new challenges. Rapid expansion strained support systems, and some newer participants struggled with the technological learning curve. Quality control became more difficult to maintain as the project scaled beyond the intensive supervision possible during pilot phases. Dr. Worku identified concerning trends in some areas where commercial success had led to monoculture cultivation, potentially reducing agricultural biodiversity and increasing vulnerability to pests or climate variations. The partnership needed to balance productivity goals with sustainable farming practices. Environmental monitoring revealed mostly positive impacts, but some concerns emerged. Increased mechanization had led to soil compaction in certain areas. Water usage, while more efficient than traditional methods, was straining some local water sources during dry seasons. The success attracted international competition. European agricultural companies began offering alternative partnerships to Ethiopian farmers, sometimes with more generous upfront payments but less comprehensive long-term support. Some communities found themselves weighing short-term financial gains against sustained development relationships. Nigerian domestic politics created additional pressure. Opposition parties criticized the government for investing billions in Ethiopian agriculture, while Nigerian farmers continued facing challenges. Dr. Adesina found himself defending the partnership's benefits for Nigerian agricultural development and food security. The partnership's governance structure evolved to address these complexities. Joint oversight committees included representatives from farming communities, ensuring that local voices influenced policy decisions. Regular evaluation processes identified problems early and adjusted implementation strategies accordingly. Women's participation had exceeded all expectations. Female entrepreneurs were operating 30% of the processing and value addition enterprises created through the partnership. Ethiopian women's cooperatives had become suppliers to Nigerian companies, creating direct business relationships that bypassed traditional male-dominated trading networks. The technology transfer continued producing innovations. Ethiopian traditional seed varieties, enhanced with Nigerian breeding techniques, were showing superior performance in drought conditions. These hybrid approaches were attracting attention from international agricultural research institutions. Youth. Engagement programs had trained over 10,000 young people in agricultural technology, business management, and cooperative organization. Many were establishing their own farming enterprises or agricultural service businesses, creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem around the partnership. The partnership's success influenced continental agricultural policy. The African Union adopted many of the Ethiopia-Nigeria collaboration principles in its comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program. Similar bilateral agricultural partnerships were being negotiated between other country pairs across the continent. International donors who had initially been skeptical began providing additional support. The World Bank approved a $500 million loan to expand the partnership into additional Ethiopian regions. The European Union funded complementary infrastructure projects that enhanced the partnership's impact. The supply chain integration reached sophisticated levels. Nigerian companies could track Ethiopian agricultural products from field to consumer, ensuring quality control and enabling premium pricing for sustainably produced items. Ethiopian farmers received real-time market information that helped optimize their planting and harvesting decisions. Cultural exchange had become an unexpected benefit. Thousands of Nigerians and Ethiopians had traveled between countries for training, business development, and technical support. These personal relationships strengthened the partnership's foundation beyond purely economic considerations. The educational impact was particularly significant. Ethiopian universities established agricultural engineering programs with Nigerian technical support. Nigerian institutions began offering specialized programs in highland agriculture and traditional farming systems. Student exchange programs created a new generation of African agricultural professionals with continental perspectives. Regional food security improved measurably. During a drought year, Ethiopian reserves were able to supply neighboring countries with grain, while Nigerian processing capacity ensured food remained affordable across West Africa. The partnership had created resilience that benefited the entire region. As the partnership approached its third anniversary, both governments began planning for the next phase of expansion. The success had proven that African countries could collaborate effectively on continental-scale projects, creating a model for addressing shared challenges through mutual cooperation rather than external dependence. 5 years after the first handshake between Ethiopian and Nigerian officials, the partnership had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The $2.5 billion investment had generated over $8 billion in economic value across both countries, but the true measure of success was written in the faces of farming families whose lives had been transformed. Amara, now 45 years old, had become a regional coordinator for women's agricultural cooperatives. Her own farm had grown into a model operation that hosted international visitors studying sustainable agriculture practices. The woman who once worried about feeding her family now employed 30 people and had sent 3 of her children to university. Turkey. Partnership had evolved into something resembling a continental agricultural ecosystem. Ethiopian farmers were growing crops specifically designed for Nigerian processing facilities, while Nigerian companies had established permanent operations across rural Ethiopia. The integration was so complete that distinguishing between Ethiopian and Nigerian components of the supply chain had become meaningless. Dr. Adesina, now serving his second term as Nigeria's agriculture minister, stood before the United Nations General Assembly presenting the partnership as a model for South-South cooperation. His presentation highlighted how 2 African nations had addressed food security challenges through mutual support rather than dependence on external assistance. The environmental impact had exceeded sustainability targets. Reforestation programs connected to the partnership had restored over 100,000 hectares of degraded land. Carbon sequestration from improved farming practices was generating revenue through international carbon credit markets, providing additional income for participating communities. Technology development had become truly collaborative. The joint agricultural research centers established in both countries were producing innovations that attracted global attention. Drought-resistant crop varieties developed through the partnership were being adopted across sub-Saharan Africa, helping millions of farmers adapt to climate change. Ethiopian agricultural exports had diversified dramatically. While coffee remained important, the country was now a major supplier of wheat, barley, and processed foods to West African markets. This diversification reduced vulnerability to coffee price fluctuations and created year-round employment opportunities. Nigerian food security had been revolutionized. The country that once imported 90% of its wheat now produced 70% domestically through Ethiopian partnerships and improved Nigerian farming. Food inflation, which had terrorized consumers for decades, stabilized as reliable supply chains reduced price volatility. The partnership's governance model was being studied by international development organizations. The combination of government support, private sector investment, and community participation had created a sustainable framework that avoided many pitfalls of traditional development projects. Young entrepreneurs were creating the next generation of agricultural businesses. Kemi Adebayo, the Nigerian engineer who had led early infrastructure development, now operated a consulting company that was replicating the Ethiopia-Nigeria model across other African countries. Her firm had projects in Ghana, Ivory Coast, Kenya, and Tanzania. Educational outcomes were remarkable. Rural Ethiopian regions that had struggled with literacy rates now boasted technical training centers that attracted students from across East Africa. Nigerian agricultural universities had established permanent campuses in Ethiopia, creating integrated educational networks. The cultural impact was profound but subtle. Ethiopian coffee ceremonies in Nigerian cities had become common, while Nigerian Nollywood films featuring Ethiopian locations were popular across East Africa. Marriage between Nigerians and Ethiopians involved in the partnership had created binational families that embodied continental unity. International recognition came in many forms. The partnership received the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's Prize for Excellence in South-South Cooperation. Time magazine featured the collaboration as one of 10 projects that are changing Africa. However, the most meaningful recognition came from other African countries seeking to replicate the model. The expansion phase was ambitious beyond the original vision. Morocco and Senegal had signed a similar agricultural partnership agreement. Kenya and Ghana were negotiating technology-sharing arrangements. The African Union had established a Continental Agricultural Partnership Facilitation Office based on the Ethiopia-Nigeria experience. Challenges remained significant. Climate change continued threatening agricultural productivity across both countries. Market volatility occasionally disrupted supply chains. Some communities struggled to adapt to rapid changes in farming practices and economic systems. The financial returns had attracted international investment interest. European and Asian companies were seeking partnerships with the Ethiopian-Nigerian agricultural network. However, both governments maintained policies ensuring that external partnerships supported, rather than displaced, the bilateral collaboration. The partnership had created its own momentum for continuous innovation. Annual conferences brought together thousands of farmers, researchers, and business people to share experiences and develop new approaches. These gatherings had become major events in continental agricultural calendars. The next generation was already taking leadership roles. Meseret Alemu, the young woman who had chosen agricultural training over urban migration, was now managing agricultural development programs across 3 Ethiopian regions. Her counterpart in Nigeria was establishing farmer training centers that served participants from 5 West African countries. Regional food systems had been fundamentally altered. During the previous year's drought in East Africa, Ethiopian grain reserves had prevented famine across the Horn of Africa. Nigerian processing capabilities ensured that surplus harvests in good years were preserved and distributed during difficult periods. The partnership's success had influenced global agricultural policy discussions. International development agencies were shifting resources toward supporting similar South-South collaborations rather than traditional North-South aid relationships. The Ethiopia-Nigeria model demonstrated that developing countries could solve their own challenges through creative partnerships. As Amara looked across her thriving farm toward the mountains where new processing facilities were being constructed, She reflected on how much had changed since that desperate morning when she knelt beside withered crops. The transformation hadn't been just about technology or investment. It had been about recognizing that African countries possessed complementary strengths that, when combined thoughtfully, could overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable when faced alone. The $2.5 billion Ethiopia-Nigeria agricultural partnership had proven that Africa could indeed feed itself, and perhaps the world, through the power of continental cooperation and shared determination to build a better future for farming families across the continent.